He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
This is Mediawatch. I'm Colin Peacock. Well, nearly 20 years ago, complicated arrangements of US-based banks nearly brought the global financial system to its knees, and the fallout of the GFC fell almost everywhere, and a lack of accountability was at the heart of it. Well, now we're also in pretty volatile times with AI inflating the global economy, and some say that's another bubble waiting to burst, unless governments put greater guardrails around it. Well, one leading scholar has been saying so here, and that's in the week that the main man of Microsoft flew in to urge all of us to embrace AI here. And she also says the media have a role in this, and they have a lot to lose themselves. But before all that, it's been a frantic political week as the Prime Minister came out on top in a put-up or shut-up vote of confidence. And while he was at it, Christopher Luxon kind of told the media to shut up too. But how did it get to that? And was it the media's fault?
Do you enjoy talking to the media?
Love it. Yeah, I make myself very available to the media.
They say a week is a long time in politics, but it's 6 weeks since the Prime Minister told Ingrid Hipkiss that on RNZ's Morning Report. And the reason she asked him in the first place was that he didn't seem all that keen to go on TVNZ's Q&A show with Jack Tame, who told his viewers this the previous day.
He declined our invitation, which means it's now more than 15 months since the Prime Minister last sat here for an interview.
And last Friday, coincidentally, it was Jack Tame presenting One News at 6 and telling the viewers this.
The Prime Minister has pulled out of a long-standing weekly slot on TVNZ's Breakfast. Christopher Luxon's office confirming to One News that he'll decide on future interviews on a case-by-case basis. The change comes in the same week the National Party leader survived a confidence vote that he called on himself.
And the Prime Minister had a message for the media himself after that vote, which we'll get to in a minute here on Mediawatch. But on One News last Friday, Jack Tame also told the One News viewers this.
Separately, the National Party has raised concerns to TVNZ, claiming its staff members broke parliamentary rules trying to interview Chief Whip Stuart Smith. TVNZ says it has a different view of what took place and that any complaint in Parliament should go to the Speaker.
But that was all that TVNZ's One News had to say about that snub of TVNZ's breakfast show, and what TVNZ insisted was a separate development, the National Party complaining about the conduct of TVNZ's political staff in Parliament this week. But when News Talk ZB led its 6 p.m. news bulletin with that, it definitely didn't separate those two stories.
The Prime Minister's pulled out of his weekly TVNZ breakfast interview as a row escalates between the broadcaster and the National Party. Political reporter Ethan Griffiths has more.
TVNZ says Chris Luxon's office informed them he'll no longer appear every Monday and consider interviews case by case. Senior National MP Simeon Brown has confirmed the party's later complaint against TVNZ. He alleges journalists followed party whip Stuart Smith into his office corridor and aggressively banged on his door.
Stuart Smith is the National Party's whip, who the media really wanted to talk to after the Herald reported last week that the Prime Minister had ghosted him when he tried to raise some MPs' unhappiness with the PM about his leadership. Neither Smith nor Luxon denied that story all the way up to that caucus confidence vote last Tuesday, which in the end, Whip Stuart Smith didn't even attend. And the explanation for that, which came from the Prime Minister's office, didn't convince many in the media, including the crew of the Spin-Off's Gone by Lunchtime podcast.
He had a long-standing personal appointment on Tuesday morning in the South Island, presumably in the South Island, that he had sort of forgotten about previously, but he really needed to be at rather than the caucus.
Do you think by long-standing they meant him standing for a long time at the bottom of a well somewhere between like Kokoda and Canterbury?
But TVNZ's political journalists' allegedly aggressive pursuit of Stuart Smith in Parliament was no laughing matter, according to MP Simeon Brown, who's also, as it happens, the National Party election campaign chair. In social media posts on Friday, Simeon Brown complained that there was aggressive and prolonged banging on Smith's office door by TVNZ political journalists late at night. And also, pressure applied about how he would be portrayed on TVNZ's breakfast show the next day if he didn't come out and talk to them. New Zealanders want balanced, fair and accurate media, reporting on the issues that matter and not a media-driven soap opera, Simeon Brown said on social media, echoing the words of his Prime Minister on Tuesday when he called out media speculation about his own leadership. And Simeon Brown was happy then to go on News Talk ZB's Drive show on Friday and talk about all that, but not to name the TVNZ names the host Heather Duplessis-Allen wanted to hear.
Was this Mikey Sherman?
I'm not going to go into which staff members it was, but it was staff from TVN's political team at Parliament.
And was it Tom Day?
Again, I'm not going to go into who was there.
Simeon Brown also confirmed that a recording of at least part of that encounter exists and that another National MP witnessed it. And as we heard, TVNZ says it has a very different view of what happened, but they didn't say what that was to anyone. So we'll see in the end if they, or Parliament's Speaker, decide that anything further is needed in response to National's complaint about this case. But when ZB's Heather Duplessis-Allen asked Simeon Brown if he was really concerned about TVNZ's political conduct more broadly, he gave a very political answer.
They want to see balanced reporting, and I think many New Zealanders have, quite frankly, just had enough of what they're seeing.
Yeah.
And we decided to complain about this because ultimately it's also against the parliamentary rules.
Yeah, but
it just demonstrates the type of behaviours that we're seeing more and more of.
Heather Duplessis-Allen didn't ask Simeon Brown what New Zealanders might make of his leader's decision to snub the breakfast show. But on her own show, Heather Duplessis-Allen had her say on that.
So if he is not good in media interviews, on balance, probably he is better off not doing these interviews in an election year. The trouble is, people will see this for what it is, which is that he is running scared.
Though she also said most people out there hate the media and just don't care. She also made the point that TVNZ's breakfast show and Q&A show are different beasts and they shouldn't be punished for anything untoward in Parliament. But there was also someone else to blame.
This is what Jacinda started, right? When Jacinda did it, I said, watch, because this is going to start a thing and it's going to happen all over the show afterwards. And if you didn't like Jacinda doing it, have the same standard. You can't hate what Jacinda did and then love what Chris Luxon has done.
5 years ago, Jacinda Ardern abandoned her weekly Prime Minister's interview on News Talk ZB's Mike Hosking breakfast show, and it didn't go down well with the host.
She is running for the hills. She no longer wants to be on this program each week. The somewhat tragic conclusion that is drawn is that the question she gets, the demand for a level of accountability, is a little bit tough. She hates a hard question, she hates fact, she hates accountability, she hates not being fawned over.
And that was one of several sprays that Mike Hosking had at the former Prime Minister back then. And the ZB political editor back then, Barry Soper, also accused Ardern of using COVID-19 as her security blanket and failing to socialise with the parliamentary press gallery on the 9th floor like other Prime Ministers did, though other Prime Ministers didn't have a newborn at home at the time. These days, Barry Soper is a senior political correspondent at ZB, and last Friday, he also criticised Christopher Luxon blanking breakfast at TVNZ, but mainly for the Prime Minister's own political purposes.
The problem here is we're in an election year. Yeah. We're 6 months or so out from a general election, and I would have thought a politician should make himself available to any media outlet, regardless of how stupid you might think
or biased
the questions are, or biased you say the organisation is. Yeah, I think it's a fundamental error.
But one less interview a week also means one less chance for the Prime Minister to trip up. And as the Herald website reported on Friday under the headline, "It's all over Tova," new breakfast show host Tova O'Brien had discomfited the Prime Minister on 2 out of 3 of their weekly chats so far. How TVNZ handles the empty chair on Monday morning this week, and other media too, will be fascinating. To be clear, the Prime Minister's office has confirmed that he will still be on with ZB each Monday and on RNZ's Morning Report, where what he says certainly does get scrutinised.
A tough week ahead for the Prime Minister. Boy, he was saying the words, but was he persuading anyone, including himself, this morning?
Well, the takeaway for me this morning was that apparently not everyone wants to invite him to a barbecue.
That was RNZ's political editor Joe Moyer talking there to John Campbell on RNZ's Morning Report last Monday.
That felt like a line that had come from somewhere else, didn't it? I guess this is referring back to John Key, the sense of John Key as the barbecue guy, right?
Yeah, I think he's probably trying to make the point that and he's long claimed this, that he does things a little bit differently, and he is a bit different. And I think we have seen that, and you see that in the way that he runs Cabinet and the way that he runs his caucus.
Well, that line about not being everybody's barbecue buddy actually came just half an hour earlier in a sympathetic hearing on News Talk ZB's Mike Hosking breakfast.
Well, I get it. Not everyone want me at their barbecue.
But the main revelation that came out of Hosking's heart-to-heart with the Prime Minister last Monday was that a few backbenchers were unhappy with him, and he even put a number on it.
I read the article. There'll be a handful of people who understandably be disgruntled.
What's a handful? Is it
five,
three? Five. So you got five.
I'd say so. There's probably 5 people that are, moaning and frustrated.
Well, the article the Prime Minister referred to there, the one that started all of this, came the previous Friday on the front page of the New Zealand Herald. In it, Herald political editor Thomas Coughlan reported that the Prime Minister had dodged his own chief whip to avoid chatting about MPs' disgruntlement. The spin-off's Toby Manhire called it a devastating scoop that suggests a fuse has been lit for the Prime Minister. And according to Toby Manhire, a clock was ticking as well. He said the Prime Minister would now have to negotiate hurdles over the next 100 hours when the discontent, serious or not, would have to be confronted. But on TVNZ's breakfast that day, Tova O'Brien followed up the Herald scoop by citing sources of their own.
A source from within the National Party caucus says that the camp that wants to see leadership change believes that they do have the numbers, but that they want the Prime Minister to stand down. They don't want blood spilled on the floor, and this follows reporting in the New Zealand Herald this morning.
And after that, Tova O'Brien grilled National Party-aligned blogger Liam Hare in the back of his car on a video call.
Of all the names that were mentioned to me, they're all sort of people whose careers have stalled, who have sort of been a bit disgraced, and who haven't become ministers or aren't current ministers in an environment where the National Party doesn't have unlimited ministries to sort of hand out.
Well, Liam here didn't name any among what he called the coalition of losers, but that was frustrating stuff for viewers outside the commentariat, still in the dark about whether a coup could be coming or not. Now, at this point, which was fully 10 days ago now, News Talk ZB's Mike Hosking was definitive. No one was going to do a coup because the Prime Minister had passed them over for a promotion previously.
They won't. They've got no balls. They're spineless. There's a handful of spineless losers in there that are fearing for their job. So they're not going to mount a coup. Mark my words.
Now, on the Herald's front page, it was no coincidence that Thomas Coughlan's scoop was illustrated with a photo of Chris Bishop. And when he fronted up on the Mike Hosking breakfast that same day, the host was startled to hear that the minister hadn't read that article yet.
Are you going for something or not? Don't dick us around. What's going on?
Now, on the Mike Hosking breakfast, the host plays a game where any hesitation from a guest is dubbed a pause of inner turmoil and then mocked in replays with the sound of a truck driving through it. And Mike Hosking was pretty pleased with how that went last week.
5 pauses of inner turmoil. Come on! It's a record.
Now, after all of this, it was inevitable that the Prime Minister's next media stand-up, a photo opportunity in Pōkeno, would be derailed by questions about his leadership.
No, not at all. Okay, thanks so much, team. Have a good day.
How closely are you watching Chris Bishop, Prime Minister?
And after that, there was plenty more in last weekend's papers, including from the Herald's Thomas Coughlan, who'd started it all. And also last Sunday, Chris Bishop was first up on TVNZ's Q&A show with Jack Tame, who, like Mike Hosking, didn't want to be dicked around by the minister, but was a little less crude in saying so.
I'm going to appeal to your truthfulness. Do you know of anyone in the National Party caucus who thinks Christopher Luxon should not be the party leader?
No.
And after the minister handled many questions about that pretty deftly, Jack Tame then hit him with this.
Just so you know, we have a One News Varian poll being released at 6 p.m. tonight.
And as you'll probably know by now, TVNZ's poll last Sunday was very bad news for National, for the coalition and for the Prime Minister himself, as relayed by an energised political editor, Mikey Sherman.
Well, it certainly tips a lot more fuel onto the fire. The question is, will the caucus and the party hierarchy continue to back Christopher Luxon?
That fuel on the fire heated up another Monday morning media round for the Prime Minister, where he actually pushed back at TVNZ's Tova O'Brien on breakfast when she claimed some in the caucus want you gone.
Well, I just encourage you and the media, if you want to talk about polls...
It's not me. It's your MPs, it's voters, it's business confidence.
But every week I end up discussing a poll with media. That's not where the New Zealand people are at. The New Zealand people are at making sure that we have strong economic management and stable coalition government.
And when the Prime Minister turned up in Hosking's studio soon after that, it was Mike Hosking doing much of the talking himself.
Scuttlebutt, no challenger, no spill, no numbers, just a handful of half-wits at the back of the National Party who want to cause trouble.
Yeah, so that's why
unless that stops, yes, it will be corrosive to your chances of winning this election.
Correct.
Well, the next hurdle for the under-pressure Prime Minister was his weekly post-cabinet press conference last Monday. But after the Prime Minister walked back those claims of 5 frustrated MPs, ZB's Mike Hosking then walked them forward again on the morning of Tuesday's crucial caucus meeting by naming the names that he'd heard.
I don't know how widely these names are known, because I don't care and I haven't inquired, but I've got impeccable sources. So just so I don't confuse anybody, Van der Molen, Uffendal, Kuriger, Bailey and Mooney are your famous 5.
Well, some of those who do deny being among the 5 do care. They're now formally complaining, and Andrew Bailey wants an apology on the air from Mike Hosking. And when the Prime Minister fronted his caucus colleagues on Tuesday and won his vote of confidence that he had set in motion, he had this message prepared for the media afterwards.
Kiwis expect the media to ask us the tough questions about our policies, to hold us to account for our pledges to New Zealanders, and to interrogate us about the things that matter to them. They are not interested in this media soap opera. Everyday Kiwis will not be losing sleep over political slideshows here in Wellington.
And after that, the Prime Minister walked away, leaving all the Free Press's questions unanswered. So would just refusing to answer any media questions about his leadership really work now? Jessie Mulligan asked RNZ's Joe Moyer live on air soon after the announcement on Tuesday.
I don't think I've ever seen that strategy work. So if he thinks that he might be the first to pull it off, then, good luck.
And what did the media make of the Prime Minister telling them that they had the wrong focus on important issues and were not properly serving their public?
Really has been leading the news for about a week now without much new to report on. Is there a sense in which the media has created this story itself for the clicks? And because really it is good sport, or as the Prime Minister calls it, a soap opera.
A big question, and Joe Moyer's response was that the big issues the Prime Minister said were really important were not being ignored.
Stories are written about those sorts of things every day. In fact, in the post-cabinet press conference yesterday, the questions I asked the Prime Minister were very specifically about the impact that these ongoing severe frequent weather events are having on communities and what the government was doing about that. And there was some frustration from him about my questions around that. I wasn't asking questions about his leadership. I was asking questions about flood protection, climate resilience. So those questions are being asked.
However, veteran political observer Richard Harman, on his own platform Politic, reckoned that the Prime Minister did have a point.
It's hard to think of any Prime Minister who's had to face the constant drip, drip, drip of attacks on his leadership, particularly from people who might ordinarily be thought of as friends.
News Talk ZB's afternoon host Tyler Adams also accused political reporters of seizing on the Prime Minister's problems like this.
And I think there's some fair criticism for the egos involved in that political gallery and how fizzed up they get by the smell of their own crap.
But along with co-host Matt Heath, he filled almost 2 hours of talkback that day with callers who mostly reckoned that he was right about that.
Everything that Luxon does, that little flub that he had a few weeks ago, and admittedly, you go, he could have done better than that, mate. But Television New Zealand was still playing that clip 2 weeks later.
Well, agree or disagree, the Prime Minister has the backing of his caucus now. Days of Our Political Lives was the Herald's headline that same morning, riffing on the Prime Minister's pleas to call time on the soap opera that they'd been running. And the irony was that Thomas Coughlin's scoop in the Herald that sparked all of this 10 days ago was headlined A Fractious Fortnight, and it predicted the Prime Minister would face the most difficult 2 weeks of his leadership. Yet, as we now know, the tipping point tipped in the Prime Minister's favour within just 5 days last Tuesday. Last week here on Mediawatch, we heard all about how the latest annual survey of trust in the news media here had recorded a jump after slumps for the previous 6 years in a row. And one reason suggested for that was all the AI slop and misinformation that's circulating elsewhere online. Now, not everyone was convinced by that argument, but writing in the Herald last Wednesday, PR professional and pundit Trish Sherson reckoned that it did stack up.
It's not sentimental, it's rational. When almost anything can be produced in seconds, the scarce thing is no longer content, it's credibility. People want to know what's real, who stands behind it, and whether anyone applied judgment before it was pushed into the world.
And the good news for the news media in this part of the world, Trish Sherson reckoned, was that the local understanding matters even more in an AI age.
We are a small market, and often that's seen as a weakness. But small also means close to the ground. Our best journalists understand the fabric of this country in a way offshore systems never will.
But the local media are still a fragile business compared to the offshore tech platforms that make all this AI stuff. The same day, the Herald also had a story in which the New Zealand boss of one of the biggest outfits, Microsoft, claimed that AI could boost the New Zealand economy by more than $100 billion in the next 12 years, and that it already supports close to 50,000 jobs here. And the reason for releasing that was the arrival in Auckland of Microsoft's global chief executive, Satya Nadella, one of the most powerful people in the most lucrative and influential industries on the planet. And on the Ryan Bridge Today show on Herald Now, the host asked the business desk tech writer Peter Griffin, why was he here?
So what is today all about?
Well, Satya Nadella is at the end of his AI tour, really pushing the artificial intelligence message around the world, and obviously Microsoft has invested billions in this directly through its own company, but also its investment in OpenAI, which is the creator of ChatGPT. So today we're going to see the message from Satya to New Zealand business: you need to accelerate your uptake of AI.
And Peter Griffin went on to tell Ryan Bridge he was not at all sure about the big claims Microsoft was making. He reminded his readers on Business Desk of the dubious and widely reported claims that Amazon Web Services had made when they flew in with promises of new data centres and investment just last year. And while AI is developing fast, Peter Griffin said AI isn't really new anymore and hasn't actually delivered on many of its promises yet.
How can they really help this country capitalise on this technology to truly lift our productivity and lift our social well-being and standard of living? There's some signs that some companies are accelerating and getting those gains, but we're not seeing that societal lift yet 4 or 5 years into this revolution that ChatGPT kicked off.
Peter Griffin was the only New Zealand journalist to be able to interview Microsoft's main man while he was here, and when he put all that to Satya Nadella, he drew on the past.
By the end of, beginning of 2000s, for example, what the PCs did in the workforce started coming out in the economic data because it took a little bit of time for the workflow and the work artifacts to change, right? I always sort of go back to this example. I mean, just imagine in the 80s, how did we do a forecast, right? We sent faxes around and we did inter-office memos and we had a forecast, which by the time it came out was out of date. Then we said, here's a PC, here's an Excel spreadsheet, and just attach a spreadsheet to an email, and people enter numbers, and you have a much more real-time forecast. And if you're a retailer or a manufacturer or what have you, suddenly your productivity improved.
Well, PCs and software programs have been pretty handy these past 25 years, for sure. But Peter Griffin said that until the benefits of AI are felt beyond a narrow set of early adopters, Microsoft's big productivity story will remain just that, a story. Another reporter watching with interest is Will Mace, who has the tech beat for NBR, and he noted that this government had announced a light touch approach to AI regulation just last year.
I suppose sending that message out into the market, as Minister Collins did, she was the minister at the time, was really, I suppose, throwing open the doors, if they weren't already, to tech players, US tech, big tech conglomerates in particular, to the New Zealand market and saying, hey, you can come here, do business here, take us along on the ride.
But writing in the NBR, William Mace said we cannot afford for light touch regulation to make this country a soft touch for global tech companies. Now, he formed that view after a conference last week on law, technology and government at the Centre for Advancing Law and Technology Responsibly, ALTA for short, at the University of Auckland. The centre's head is Professor Alexandra Andov, who came here last year from another nation of 5 million or so, Denmark. In a keynote address headed Big Tech, Too Big to Fail, Professor Andov compared the current market power of big tech to the time before 2008, when freewheeling US banks were about to spark the global financial crisis. So with one of the biggest names in the AI game in town here this week, though mostly under the media's radar, I asked her if the media here had a role to play in this.
Absolutely. And I think that the media's job ultimately is to co-create an informed public. And I do think that the big tech is one of the most consequential governance questions of this generation. And investigative journalism, public explanation of how the system works, holding regulators accountable for inaction, if there is. All of that is essential democratic infrastructure. Ultimately, the media is to some extent also dependent on them, right? So we can see that Google captures, I don't know, somewhere between 25 to 35% of global digital advertising revenue. Then Meta has another one. So I think over the last, again, 20 years, maybe 15 years, we've saw that also New Zealand media companies have watched their advertising revenue collapse over the past decade as these money flow to platforms. So when a media outlet is deciding how hard to push on big tech, how hard to push on their regulation, they are making the decision while being commercially dependent on the same companies they might criticize, right, for distribution, for advertising, for traffic.
Media have found the products of big tech fantastically useful. Do you think we need to have specific regulation that could protect media companies and their particular role in society, or even kind of compensate them for this?
And so I think this is still a live policy question with probably good arguments on both sides, but we should definitely experiment. Yes, there is definitely some form of regulation, not just to protect the entities per se, but protect the mission, protect the value that we hold for media in our society, so to not be dependent on centralization or one foreign outlet to control the content and information within our own society. So the case for regulation is that media organizations produce the public interest journalism that we depend on. Journalism has been systematically defunded by the shift of advertising revenue. We see that Australia's news media bargaining code, which ultimately compelled Google and Meta to negotiate payment arrangements with news publishers, is probably one of the more significant attempts to address this structurally. I do think that the evidence for now is a little bit mixed, but not negligible.
Our government has backed away from that, though, haven't they? Because they think any attempt to compel US-based tech companies specifically to support the news media here would count as a kind of taxation on a US company in the eyes of the Trump administration, which seems determined to protect those companies from what they say is penalising American companies in the world.
This is the question. Probably you're right, that Trump might ultimately see it in this way. But I think that the other question is, yes, but how do we still protect our own democracy? I think that here in New Zealand, I hear very often that, we are too small and we want to be obviously in good relationships with the US and so on. But I think that, Australia has done that. Canada is going to do that. There are a number of countries in European Union that is ultimately actually trying to de-big tech their own infrastructure, such as Germany or France. Are we brave enough to be part of this movement, or are we going to wait till, New Zealand has a great PR across the world and we should be proud of it, and we should definitely protect our democracy.
And does the media have a little bit of leverage here in a sense? You said in your address, we are feeding the machine willingly, one term of service at a time, one job at a time, potentially one industry at a time, all kind of acquiescing to this dominance of big tech and their products. But when we consider AI companies need factual content, the media has a vast database of, to make their large language models work, to make the likes of ChatGPT make some sort of sense. Is this a lever the media can pull rather than just kind of extracting license fees from AI? This is something they need to protect, or perhaps that governments need to protect for them?
100%. And we see that this is actually already happening. So on one hand, you have different kinds of legal actions that large media companies have initiated, right? The biggest cases that has been launched against OpenAI and Microsoft was by the New York Times, right? That they have stolen all of the data based on which they train their LLM models. And I think that we should not actually forget about this. I think that now, because you know how prevalent and how present AI is in our life, we somehow forgot that how did we get here? How did these companies ultimately train these LLMs? And hopefully these decisions will come out and they will have certain impact on how the data is collected and whether there is some form of a remuneration. So and I believe there will be. On the other hand, we see that some other companies, such as Anthropic, already has been also sued, but they try to ultimately come to some form of a dispensation. And then there is a third line in the UK where you have BBC and a line that try to come to some form of an agreement where yes, the AI companies are able to use them, but again, for certain kind of remuneration. And this speaks to the fact that yes, 100%, the AI companies need correct and good content to actually produce correct and good outcomes, right? Yes, the way how I think this will play out is either by regulation, B, by the fact that larger entities such as New York Times will sue, and they will show ultimately that, yes, in order to create all of these large language models, these companies have stolen a lot of copyrighted material without any kind of remuneration or consideration.
Well, you also highlighted in your talk procurement as the lever that's most directly in any country's hands. I mean, often that's the government buying goods and services with their national treasury. You say procurement law is digital sovereignty in disguise. So could this actually help our news media? Should they push for that?
So, yes, I moved to New Zealand from Europe, and obviously in the EU you have the public procurement is a great tool, because if you think of how much the governments are spending, through this spending the governments can create markets and they can nudge certain markets and industries to behave in a particular way. And I think this is something that we need to also realize here in New Zealand, that the governments decide what they are willing to run on, and they use the purchasing power of the state to ultimately set the conditions that the market would not otherwise impose necessarily. So maybe not through necessarily just regulation, but through the contracts. And this ultimately means three things, I think. First, that the data localization and sovereignty requirement, this is something that we should, and I believe that there have been different kinds of discussions in this country as well. How do we make sure that our data stays in New Zealand? How do we also protect Maori data? How do we protect our own kind of relevant data to stay in New Zealand and not necessarily just go somewhere else and be used in a way that we are not aware of or we have no control over, right? So that's one of the things. Second, to make sure that all of those entities that provide certain services to the government might be even local. Right? So we have a lot of tech companies here in New Zealand. Why is it that we want to rely within our national and critical infrastructure? There is definitely a space for us in New Zealand to discuss how we can use public procurement more efficiently in order to support the New Zealand economy, in order to support the production of technology and export of New Zealand technology abroad.
Well, with that in mind, I wonder if we had a missed opportunity for our media this week. The global chief executive of Microsoft was here. You know, he only did one interview with one journalist while he was here. This could have actually been an opportunity where, you know, we have this incredibly powerful person in this incredibly powerful industry here, and not much discussion of the sorts of things that we've just been talking about.
You know, whenever any type of companies or entities showcase these huge figures, right? How did we get to this number, and what this number actually means for the economy before we start to treat it as fact, right? So any kind of economic projections of this kind benefiting to a national economy over a 12-year period, ultimately from a technology that is currently being adopted, are produced by the companies selling the technology and should be read accordingly. They might be a little bit more optimistic as it comes to productivity. There are some assumptions where it might not necessarily become reality. So yes, I would definitely urge all of the news media to ultimately challenge this, or at least scrutinize it to some extent. How did we get to this number? Is this commission report? What assumptions underlie this kind of multiplier? Also, does it account for job displacement? Does it model the scenario in which the economic value created ultimately flows primarily to Microsoft shareholders rather than to the New Zealand workers and businesses? So I think there are many, many questions. And as you, Colin, pointed out, there was only one interview. So I would ask why.
Indeed. And, well, of course, it was a sales pitch, wasn't it, effectively? And from the few reports of what he told thousands of people at the Auckland Convention Centre, he talked of frontier transformation with AI technology. But there was also reports about the potential of the kind of Wild West where business secrets can be learned and co-opted by AI very, very quickly. What does that mean for IP and for competitive advantage and all this? There's a sovereignty risk in that maybe for the media too, from things like media's original product can be almost taken and stripped out. A lot of industries will face this from AI.
I think you're 100% on the biggest question mark that there is. And here maybe the last point that we could leave the listeners with. One of the things that we should still realize and question is ultimately the business model of AI companies, right? One thing is obviously Microsoft is not per se an AI company. Microsoft is a tech company that has many products, right? But they obviously heavily invested billions and billions of dollars into both OpenAI, Anthropic, and obviously some other models themselves.
It's like the distinction you made. You said we have built a world where companies operate within markets, not a world where companies are the markets, and that's kind of what's happening.
And Microsoft is the market, right? Let's say OpenAI or Anthropic or other AI companies, they are still not profitable, right? And they have millions of customers, and yet they're still in red numbers. To me, this means that A, they are selling their product for a lower price than actually the product costs, which probably is the case as well. And B, the business model on which they operate is actually not the business model they want to actually work on later on. Google, at the very beginning, was this company that wanted to offer all of these great solutions for free. And they did, right? But we realized later on that these are not for free, that we are the product. If the product is for free, then you are the product. And what they realized that they can actually get all of this data, all of our behavioral data, what we search for, what we scroll, how...
And the news we read on free news websites and news services too, yeah.
So I think this is one of the things that we should still keep asking and keep questioning. Okay, if this is not really the good business model, what will be the business model? And I am afraid that exactly what you said. I think that all of the data that we have shared, all of the very, very valuable data, including media data, that they will utilize and create new businesses out of it.
That was Professor Alexandra Andov, the Chair in Law and Technology and Director of the Centre for Advancing Law and Technology Responsibly, ALTA for short, at the University of Auckland. And in a recent lecture called Big Tech, Too Big to Fail, she argued that regulating big tech here and its AI apps was urgent and in our national interest, and also, as we heard there, in the interests of our media. And finally on Mediawatch this week, the political drama we heard about earlier played out in Wellington against the backdrop to a state of emergency after 2 days of fierce rain, wind and flooding. There was plenty besides politics then for the 6 p.m. TV news bulletins to air last Monday and Tuesday. And if this had happened a couple of years ago, well, you could have watched reporting of that as well on Prime TV. Each weeknight, it used to run first at 5:30, a full half-hour bulletin made by Newshub. Well, these days they don't do news on the channel now known as Sky Open, so anyone watching at 5:30 or 6 p.m. this week would have seen a show called The World's Funniest Weather.
Welcome back to The World's Funniest Weather.
Hey, everyone! You know what they say, if you want to clean your gutters right, make sure a friend holds the ladder tight. Kind of proves my point.
The show features cell phone clips like that one of a guy falling off a ladder in the snow somewhere, all mashed up with sarcastic commentary from the host, Josie. And it's not really that funny at all, but especially not when distinctly unfunny severe weather going on in the lower North Island for real outside. But not only that, you don't learn much about the weather from the show, as many of the clips are actually nothing to do with the weather at all. Though Mediawatch did learn one thing from watching it last Tuesday: hang on to your phone while skydiving if you don't want it to end up in a pig back on Earth.
You got your phone? Yeah, I got it.
The world's funniest weather is on Sky Open every weekday at 5:30 and at 6 p.m, or Sky customers can see it on demand as often as they like on Sky Go. Well, that's all for this week. Thanks so much for listening. If you have any thoughts for us or ideas for us to follow up here on Mediawatch, do get in touch. Email us at mediawatch@rnz.co.nz, or you can even write us a letter and send it to Mediawatch, PO Box 123, Wellington. Catch you again for Midweek Mediawatch next Wednesday. In the meantime, follow Mediawatch and listen on any podcast app to make sure you never miss an episode.